After I was diagnosed with cancer and moved in with my son for treatment, I thought my family would finally be there for me. But within the first week, my daughter-in-law threw a laundry basket in front of me and said, "If you're staying here, you need to help. Wash clothes, cook meals, and stop being a burden." I stayed silent after my first chemo session, until I overheard their conversation about my house and discovered why they really wanted me there. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Before we go further, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, your city, your country? I'd love to know. Welcome to Dad Returns. A quick note, this story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling and reflection. Names and places are coincidental, but the lesson is real. There are mornings when the sun still comes through the hospital window, but you don't feel the warmth anymore. That was the kind of morning. It was early September, the kind of day where the sky over Cleveland looks almost too blue to be real, and the parking lot outside Cleveland Clinic was already half full by 8 a.m. I'd been coming to this building for routine checkups since I turned 65. I knew where to park, which elevator to take, which nurse at the front desk always smiled when she handed you the clipboard. I thought I knew exactly what kind of news I'd be walking out with. I was wrong. Dr. Thompson, a quiet man in his 50s with reading glasses, he was always pushing up his nose, set the folder down on the desk between us, and folded his hands. I'd learned over the years that when a doctor folds his hands before speaking, whatever comes next isn't going to be easy. "Walter," he said, "the results from your colonoscopy came back. We found a mass. Stage 2 colorectal cancer." I heard the words. I understood them. But for about 10 seconds, my brain just stopped. Like an engine that cuts out on a cold morning. 42 years working on ship engines at the Cleveland dockyard, and I knew exactly what it sounded like when something vital gave out. "Stage 2, I repeated. "That means it hasn't spread yet." "Correct. We caught it at a treatable stage. But Walter, you'll need chemotherapy, regular infusions once a week for approximately 16 weeks. The treatment center closest to your home is here at the clinic." He paused. "Do you have family nearby? Someone who can drive you to appointments, check in on you?" And that was the question, wasn't it? My wife Eleanor had been gone 7 years. Heart failure a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of thing that happens so fast, you don't get to say half the things you always thought you had time to say. After she passed, I stayed in our house, a small 2-bedroom on Maple Ridge Drive, nothing fancy, but Eleanor had planted roses along the front fence, and I couldn't bring myself to leave them. I'd been living alone ever since, cooking for one, watching the evening news in a quiet that had slowly become the loudest sound in my life. "I have a son," I told Dr. Thompson. "He lives in Columbus, about 40 minutes from here." "That's good," he said. "You shouldn't be doing this alone." I nodded. But I sat in my car for a long time before I started the engine. I watched people walking in and out of the hospital entrance, a young woman pushing a stroller, an older couple holding hands, a man in scrubs eating a sandwich on a bench. Life moving forward, the way it always does. I pulled out my phone and looked at Brandon's name in my contacts. My son, 40 years old. He'd grown up in that house on Maple Ridge Drive. I'd packed his lunch every day through middle school. I'd worked double shifts at the dockyard so I could pay his college tuition without him taking on loans. When he and Courtney wanted to buy their first home, I'd given them $20,000 for the down payment money. I'd saved up over 6 months of overnight shifts. I never asked for a cent back. That's not why I did it. I pressed call. It rang twice. "Hey, Dad." Brandon's voice was casual, like I was calling about the weather. "Hey, son." I cleared my throat. "I just got out of the doctor's office. I've got some news. It's not great." I kept my voice steady. I've never been a man who falls apart easily. "They found cancer, Brandon. Colon cancer. Stage 2. I'm going to need chemo treatments, and they'd be easier to manage from somewhere closer to the clinic here. Your place is, what, about 40 minutes from the hospital? There was a pause. Maybe 2 seconds. Maybe 3. Yeah, Brandon said. About that. I know it's a lot to ask, I said quickly. I'd only need a month, maybe a little more. Just until the first round of treatments is done and I get stable. I wouldn't be in the way. I can take care of myself. My voice caught just slightly. I just don't want to do this completely alone. Another pause. Shorter this time. Yeah, of course, Dad. Come on over. We'll make it work. 4 words. We'll make it work. I pressed my hand flat against the steering wheel and took a slow breath, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been wound tight since 8 o'clock that morning. My eyes stung the kind of sting you get when you've been holding yourself together for too long, and something finally gives you permission to let go just a little. Thank you, son, I said. Thank you. We worked out the details quickly. I'd come in 2 weeks once I'd tied up things at the house. Brandon said Courtney was fine with it. He said it like it was nothing, like the decision had already been made long before I called. And sitting there in that parking lot, I told myself that was a good thing, that it meant they'd been ready to help without needing to think twice about it. I didn't ask myself why a man needed 0 time to consider taking in his sick father for a month. I should have. But when you're 68 years old and you've just been told you have cancer and your son says, "Come on over," you don't sit there picking apart the tone of his voice. You just feel grateful. I drove home. I fed Eleanor's roses one last time before the season turned cold. I packed a small bag, a few sets of clothes, my medication folder, and the framed photo of Eleanor I kept on my nightstand. The one from our trip to the Smoky Mountains in 1987, where she's laughing at something I said, and the light is catching her hair just right. I told myself 1 month. I'll be home by Halloween. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have imagined, sitting in that parking lot with my eyes stinging and my heart quietly grateful, was that Brandon hadn't said yes because he was worried about me. He'd said yes because they'd already done the math. The drive from Cleveland to Columbus takes just under 40 minutes on a clear day, and that first Thursday in mid-September was about as clear as Ohio gets pale blue sky, dry air, the kind of afternoon that makes you think everything might just turn out fine. I pulled up to Brandon and Courtney's house a little after 4 in the afternoon. It was a nice place, 2 stories, brick front, a 2-car garage, a neatly trimmed lawn with a small maple tree that had just started turning orange at the edges. The kind of house I'd imagined for my son when I was working those overnight shifts. The kind of house I'd helped make possible. I sat in the car for a moment, my hands resting on the wheel, looking at the front door. I felt a tightness in my chest nerves, maybe, or just the weight of what the next few months were going to look like. Then I told myself to stop being ridiculous, grabbed my bag from the back seat, and walked up to ring the bell. Brandon opened the door. He looked the same as always. Same broad shoulders, same square jaw he'd inherited from me, same short, dark hair. But he didn't hug me. He extended his hand like I was a contractor coming to give an estimate. I shook it because what else do you do? And he stepped back to let me in. Good drive? He asked, already turning toward the living room. Pretty smooth, I said. Traffic cleared up past Akron. The house was quiet inside. Clean and decorated in that careful way Courtney liked, everything matching everything in its place. I could smell something faintly floral, like one of those plug-in air fresheners. Brandon led me through the entryway and into the living room, and that's when Courtney came in from the kitchen. My daughter-in-law, 37 years old, dark hair pulled back, wearing a white blouse that didn't have a single wrinkle in it. She was wiping her hands on a dish towel, And she looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you're not sure you have room for, starting at my face, moving down to the duffel bag over my shoulder, then stopping on the paper pharmacy bag I was carrying in my other hand. The one with my medication. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that involved her mouth, but stopped well short of her eyes. "Walter," she said. "Good to see you." "Courtney," I smiled back. "Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it." "Of course." She folded the dish towel over her arm. Then, almost as an afterthought, she tilted her head slightly and said, "I do hope you're not planning to stay longer than a month. We have a pretty tight schedule around here." The words landed quietly. Not shouted, not cruel in tone, just stated the way you'd mention a parking restriction to someone pulling into your driveway. I felt the air go out of the room, or maybe just out of me. "The doctor said the first treatment cycle runs about 16 weeks, I said carefully. "But I'll try to be as little trouble as possible." 16 weeks, she repeated, and something shifted behind her eyes. Then she smiled again, same smile as before. "Well, we'll figure it out." Brandon cleared his throat. "Let me show you the room, Dad." I followed him up the stairs, down a short hallway. We passed the guest bedroom. The door was open, and I could see a made bed, a window with afternoon light coming through it, a small desk in the corner. My heart lifted just slightly. Then Brandon kept walking. He stopped at the door at the very end of the hallway, the one closest to the utility closet. He pushed it open and stepped aside. It was a storage room. That's the only honest word for it. There was a folding bed frame set up against the far wall, pushed between two stacks of cardboard boxes. No window. A single bare bulb overhead that flickered once when Brandon pulled the string. The air smelled like dust and old cardboard, and the faint chemical bite of cleaning supplies stored on a shelf to the left. The temperature in that room was noticeably cooler than the rest of the house. I found out later there was no heating vent in there. Guest rooms being used as Courtney's home office, Brandon said, not quite meeting my eyes. "This is the best we've got right now. There's an extension cord if you need to charge your phone." I stood in the doorway and looked at that room for a long moment. Then I walked in, set my duffel bag on the floor, and placed Eleanor's photo on the edge of the shelf between a box of old tax returns and a container of motor oil. "It's fine," I said. "This is fine." Brandon nodded, relieved in a way that told me he'd been bracing for pushback. "Great. Dinner's around 7. Courtney's cooking." He pulled the door mostly shut behind him when he left. I sat down on the edge of the folding bed, and the metal frame groaned under me. I looked at Eleanor's photo, that laugh, that light, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in that parking lot 2 weeks ago. Not grief, not anger. Something quieter. A question sitting in the pit of my stomach like a stone. "What am I doing here, Elle?" I said softly. She didn't answer, of course. She never did anymore. I unpacked my clothes into a corner space between two boxes. I lined my medications up on the shelf beside her photo. I told myself what I'd been telling myself all day, 1 month. Just 1 month. But lying there that first night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, with the cold creeping in from the walls, I couldn't stop turning one thing over in my mind. When I'd told Brandon I had cancer, he'd said yes in under 3 seconds. No hesitation. No, let me talk to Courtney. No, give me a day to think it over. Just yes. At the time, that felt like love. Somewhere around midnight, I started wondering if it was something else entirely. They tell you to bring something to read during chemo. A book, a magazine, maybe a tablet with a show downloaded on it. Something to pass the time while the IV drip does what it needs to do. I brought nothing. I just sat there in that recliner chair, blue vinyl slightly too cold, and watched the clear fluid move down the tube and into the back of my left hand, and I thought about Eleanor. About the way she used to hum while she folded laundry. About how she'd always saved the crispiest piece of bacon for me without me ever asking. About how different it felt to sit in a room full of sick people when the one person who would have been holding your hand wasn't there anymore. Dr. Thompson's nurse, a heavy-set woman named Patricia, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the no-nonsense warmth of someone who'd done this job for 20 years, checked my vitals every hour and kept calling me Hon in a way that made my throat tighten every single time. "You doing okay, Hon?" she asked around noon, adjusting the drip rate. "I'm doing fine," I told her, which was mostly true. The nausea hadn't hit yet. That came later. The infusion ran 6 hours. By the time Patricia unhooked the IV line and pressed a cotton ball to the back of my hand, it was past 3 in the afternoon, and the light outside had gone flat and gray. My legs felt like they'd been filled with wet sand. My stomach was rolling in slow warning waves. I called a taxi from the lobby because I didn't want to bother Brandon at work. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth was, I hadn't even considered calling him. It hadn't crossed my mind that he might want to be there, or that he should have been. The taxi driver, a young guy who had a pine tree air freshener hanging from his mirror and country music playing low on the radio, glanced at me in the rearview mirror twice during the ride. "You all right back there?" he finally asked. "Just a long day," I said. He nodded and didn't ask anything else. I appreciated that more than I could say. By the time I walked through Brandon's front door, my legs were shaking in a way I was trying very hard not to show. The house was quiet. Brandon's car wasn't in the driveway, still at work. I thought Courtney might be out too. I was looking forward to getting to that folding bed in the storage room and lying flat for about 3 hours. I made it as far as the hallway. Courtney came out of the kitchen still wearing her work clothes, and the first thing she did was look me over from head to toe, like she was checking a package for damage. Then she set a laundry basket down on the floor in front of me. It made a heavy thud on the hardwood. It was full to the top. "Since you're home," she said, "you can go ahead and run a load." Washers at the end of the hall. I stared at that basket. My vision was doing something slightly unsteady at the edges. My stomach clenched hard, sending a sharp wave of nausea crawling up my throat. "Courtney," I said, and my voice came out thinner than I intended. "I just got back from my first chemo treatment. I've been in that chair for 6 hours. She crossed her arms and tilted her head the way someone does when they think you're being dramatic. "Cancer doesn't mean you can't do anything, Walter. It's just laundry. Just laundry." I pressed my free hand flat against the hallway wall to keep steady. The wall was cool under my palm. I focused on that, the coolness of it, and took one slow breath. "All right," I said, because what else was I going to say? That I could barely stand. That the room was tilting. That every cell in my body was screaming at me to lie down. I picked up that basket and I carried it to the end of the hall, and I loaded the machine by gripping the edge of the drum so hard my knuckles went white. I had to stop twice. Once to breathe. Once because the nausea crested so hard I had to press my forehead against the cool side of the machine and wait for it to pass. I got the load started. Then I made it to the bathroom, and I sat down on the tile floor with my back against the tub, because my legs had finally stopped cooperating entirely. My hands were trembling. Not the delicate tremble of nerves, the deep bone-level shake that comes when your body has been pushed past what it had left. I thought about Eleanor then, not as a comfort exactly, more like a conversation I needed to have. She had me doing laundry. I told her inside my head, because that's where most of my conversations with Eleanor lived these days. First day of chemo, Elle. She handed me a laundry basket. I could almost hear her. She would have had something to say about that, something with more steel in it than I was currently managing. I sat on that bathroom floor until the shaking eased, until the nausea pulled back to a dull, manageable ache. Then I washed my hands, splashed cold water on my face, and looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. 68 years old, gray at the temples, lines carved deep around my eyes from decades of squinting in the dockyard sun. I'd worked 42 years without asking for a single day off I hadn't earned. I'd buried my wife and kept going. I'd raised a son on my own after she was gone. I was not a man who crumbled. That night, Brandon came home around 7, walked past me in the living room with a brief, "Hey, how'd it go?" that didn't wait for an answer, and disappeared into the kitchen, where Courtney was already plating dinner. He never asked about the treatment. Not once that evening. Not the nausea, not the hours I'd sat in that chair, not whether I'd eaten or rested, or managed to keep anything down. I lay in that storage room that night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the muffled sound of the television from the living room, and I told myself I was thinking too hard about it. That Brandon was tired. That Courtney hadn't meant it the way it sounded. But a question had settled into my chest, somewhere between that laundry basket and the bathroom floor. And it wouldn't leave me alone. If this was just the first day, what in God's name were the days ahead going to look like? By the time the first week of October rolled around, I had developed what I can only describe as survival habits. I woke up before 6 every morning, partly because the storage room had no curtains, and the hallway light bled under the door, and partly because I'd learned that the earlier I was up and moving, the better chance I had of getting through the kitchen before Courtney staked her claim on it. The mornings I managed to pour my coffee and sit at the kitchen table in peace before the house woke up, and the air went tense. Those were the best parts of my day. Pathetic as that sounds, it was the truth. That Monday morning in early October, I decided to do something I hadn't done since arriving at Brandon's house. I decided to cook breakfast for everybody. It wasn't a grand gesture. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I'd spent 40 years making breakfast in that kitchen on Maple Ridge Drive, scrambled eggs and toast and sometimes bacon on weekends. And I thought, maybe if I contributed something real, something warm and tangible, the atmosphere in that house might shift just a little. Eleanor always said food was a kind of language. I was trying to speak it. I got the eggs out of the fridge. I found the bread. My hands still carrying the tremor that had taken up permanent residence in my fingers since the first round of chemo fumbled with the butter wrapper, and I had to press my palm flat on the counter for a second and breathe through it. The tremor wasn't painful. It was just there like a reminder I couldn't switch off. I cracked 4 eggs into the pan. The butter sizzled. I got the toast going. I was feeling not good exactly, but purposeful. Like I was doing something that mattered. Then the heat crept up too fast because my hands were slow on the dial and one side of the eggs caught and went brown at the edges before I could stop it. I was still trying to salvage the situation when Courtney walked into the kitchen at 7 o'clock sharp in a silk blouse and heels. Her hair done, her coffee mug already in hand. She stopped when she saw me at the stove. She looked at the pan. She looked at the slightly overdone eggs. She looked at me with an expression that made my stomach drop straight to the floor. "What is this?" she asked. "Breakfast," I said, keeping my voice even. "Thought I'd make something for everyone. I know the eggs got a little. She set her mug down on the counter with a sharp click and peered into the pan like she was examining evidence at a crime scene. "One side is completely burned, Walter." "It's just the one egg," I said. "The others are fine. I can make fresh ones if..." Do you know what I don't have time for in the morning? She said, cutting straight across me, her voice taking on that particular tone, the flat razor-edged one she used when she wasn't bothering to disguise what she actually thought. I don't have time to come down here and deal with a mess. My jaw tightened. I kept my eyes on the pan. I was trying to help. Help. She repeated the word like it had a bad taste. Then she straightened up, looked me dead in the face and said, "It calm as a weather report, cold as the air in that storage room at 2 in the morning. Wash my clothes and make dinner. You sick old man freeloading in my house and you still don't know your place." I felt the words hit me somewhere in the sternum. Not like a punch, more like a slow pressure, the kind that builds and keeps building until something either bends or breaks. "I'm not staying here for free," I said, and I was proud of how steady my voice came out. "I'm your father-in-law. I'm here because I'm sick, and I've been doing everything I can to stay out of your way." "Uh-huh." She picked up her coffee mug again. "We'll try harder." It was at exactly that moment that I heard footsteps on the stairs. Brandon walked into the kitchen in his work clothes, pressed khakis, the blue button-down he always wore on Mondays. He stopped when he registered. The two of us read the temperature in the room, the way any person with functional senses would have, and I watched something move across his face. Recognition. He knew what he'd walked into. I looked at my son. I held his gaze. I needed him to say something, anything. Even, "Hey, let's all just take a breath." Even a question. Even his name on my lips would have helped. Brandon picked his car keys up off the counter. He looked at Courtney, then back at me, and his face did something I will never forget. It went carefully, deliberately neutral. Like a shutter coming down. "I've got an early meeting," he said. "Save me some toast if there's any left." He walked out the front door. The sound of it closing behind him hit me harder than anything Courtney had said. I stood at that stove with a spatula in my hand and a plate of eggs I'd gotten up early to make, and my chest ached with the kind of pain that has nothing to do with cancer. My eyes burned that hot, humiliating sting of a man who refuses to cry in front of the wrong person. Courtney poured herself a fresh cup of coffee and walked out of the kitchen without another word, leaving me standing there in the smell of slightly burned butter and the wreckage of a morning I'd actually tried. I put the eggs on a plate. I sat down at the kitchen table alone. I ate every bite because I was 68 years old, and I had a chemo appointment Thursday, and I needed the protein. And because I'd be damned if I was going to throw away food I'd made with my own 2 shaking hands. I washed the dishes when I was done. I wiped down the stove. I made it so the kitchen looked like nothing had happened. But when I reached into my jacket pocket to count out the cab fare I'd need for Thursday's appointment, my fingers found the front compartment of my wallet and the $40 I was absolutely certain had been sitting there since Sunday morning was gone. I've never been a man who loses things. 42 years on the dockyard, you learn fast that carelessness costs you. A misplaced wrench means a 3-hour delay. A forgotten safety check means someone gets hurt. I kept my tools organized. I kept my paperwork filed. I kept my finances in a small green ledger that Eleanor used to tease me about because I updated it every single Sunday night without fail 30 years running. So when I stood in that kitchen doorway on Monday evening and came up short on the cab fare I needed for Thursday's appointment, I didn't assume I'd miscounted. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the folding bed and counted every bill in that wallet 3 times, spread flat across my knee in the dim light of the single overhead bulb. $100. Gone. Not 40. Not a misremembered amount. I had counted that wallet Sunday morning, $160 exact, because I always counted it on Sundays. And now I was holding 60. I sat with that number for a long time, turning it over in my mind, The way you turn a broken part in your hands looking for where the fracture started. There was only one explanation that made sense, and it sat in my chest like a hot coal. I found Courtney in the living room that evening. Her laptop open on the coffee table, a glass of white wine sweating a ring onto the coaster beside it. She looked up when I came in, and her expression was the pleasant surface-level one she used when she wanted to appear cooperative without actually being cooperative. "Courtney," I said, keeping my voice even and low, "I need to ask you something, and I'd appreciate a straight answer." She closed her laptop halfway. "Sure, Walter. What's up?" "I'm missing $100 from my wallet. I counted it Sunday morning. It's not there now." She blinked at me. Then she tilted her head, that particular tilt, the one that managed to convey both sympathy and condescension at the same time, and said, "Walter, honey, are you sure? Because chemo brain is a real thing. My aunt went through treatment and she forgot where she put her car keys 3 times a week." The words were delivered so smoothly, so warmly, that for half a second, I almost let them land. Almost. "I don't have chemo brain," I said carefully. "I have a green ledger and 42 years of keeping track of every dollar I've ever earned. $100 is missing from my wallet. That's a fact." Courtney sighed, the sigh of a woman performing patience. "Okay, Walter, I hear you. But nobody in this house took your money. Maybe it fell out somewhere. Maybe you spent it and don't remember." "I really think I didn't spend it," I said. "Well, I don't know what to tell you." She opened her laptop again. Conversation over, apparently. "I'd check your coat pockets. Sometimes things slip through." I stood there for a moment, the hot coal in my chest, burning a little hotter. My hands wanted to, not from the chemo this time, but from the effort of keeping my voice level when every instinct I had was telling me something was deeply, fundamentally wrong in this house. "Thank you, Courtney," I said. I went back to my room. I sat on the edge of that folding bed for a long time, staring at the shelf where Eleanor's photo stood between the motor oil and the old tax returns. The bulb above me hummed faintly. Outside the door, I could hear the muffled sound of the television, a laugh track rising and falling. Then I opened the nightstand drawer, the one I'd cleared out from under a stack of old magazines, and I pulled out the small notebook I'd bought at the Walgreens down the street the week before. I'd bought it to keep track of my medication schedule. That's all I'd intended it for. I opened it to the first blank page. I picked up the pen. I wrote October 13th, 2025, $100 missing from wallet. Confirmed via Sunday count. C denied, said chemo brain. I stared at what I'd written. My handwriting looked steadier than I felt. I told myself I was probably overreacting. That maybe Courtney was right, and the money had slipped somewhere. That I should give it a few days and see. I gave it 3 days. On Thursday morning, I came back from my chemo appointment, 6 more hours in that blue recliner, Patricia calling me Hon, the IV drip doing its slow work, and when I got back to the house and reached into my wallet to count out what I had left for the week, the math didn't add up again. $300. Gone from the main fold, the bills I'd organized small to large the way I always did. My throat closed up. Not from grief, from something harder than grief. From the specific bone-deep pain of having your worst suspicion confirmed. I sat on the bathroom floor, the cold tile against my back, the hum of the ventilation fan overhead, and I pressed my hand flat over my sternum, because my heart was hammering in a way that scared me a little. "Think, Walter," I said out loud to the empty bathroom, to Eleanor's memory, to whatever version of myself had walked into this house 6 weeks ago with a bag full of medication and a heart full of foolish hope. "Think before you do anything," I thought. Then I went back to my room, opened the notebook, and wrote a second entry beneath the first. I wrote down the amount, the date, the circumstances. I wrote down exactly what Courtney had said 3 days ago. I wrote down the look on Brandon's face when he'd walked out the door that Monday morning, rather than say a single word in my defense. I didn't know yet what I was building, but I knew that whatever came next, I was going to be ready for it. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have predicted, sitting on that cold bathroom floor with my chest still aching, was that the money was only the beginning. That there were other things in this house being taken from me. Things I hadn't started watching yet. The list was printed on a single sheet of paper, white with the Cleveland Clinic letterhead at the top, and I'd kept it folded in the front pocket of my medication folder since the day Dr. Thompson handed it to me. Dietary guidelines for patients undergoing colorectal cancer chemotherapy. It wasn't complicated. No heavy oils, nothing fried, nothing that had been sitting out more than 2 hours, lean proteins, green vegetables, plenty of water. Dr. Thompson had gone through it point by point at our second appointment and made me read parts of it back to him, which I'd found slightly patronizing at the time, but now understood was because he'd seen too many patients quietly ignore the things that kept them stable. Your digestive system is under significant stress from the treatment, he'd told me. What you eat isn't a preference right now. It's part of the medicine. Part of the medicine. I'd underlined that phrase. I was thinking about those words on the last Tuesday of October, when I sat down at Brandon and Courtney's dinner table and looked at what was on the plate Courtney set in front of me. It was a piece of pork that had clearly been cooked the previous night, reheated in a pan with enough oil that it was glistening under the overhead light. Beside it, a scoop of mashed potatoes made from a box, I could tell by the texture, and a spoonful of canned green beans that had gone soft and gray at the edges. The whole plate smelled faintly of the refrigerator. Brandon and Courtney had fresh chicken breast roasted vegetables and a salad with sliced avocado. I looked at my plate. I looked at theirs. I picked up my fork and set it back down. Courtney, I said quietly, I appreciate you cooking. I do. But the doctor has me on a pretty strict diet during treatment. I gestured carefully at the plate. The fat content alone is going to be really hard on my system right now. Courtney looked up from her salad with an expression that landed somewhere between pity and irritation. Walter, I cook one dinner. I don't have time to make 2 separate meals every night. I understand that, I said. I'm not asking for something elaborate. Even just a plain piece of chicken or some rice and steamed vegetables. You know, she said, cutting me off with a bright, brittle little smile. My grandmother went through chemo and she ate whatever was on the table. She said half the restrictions are overblown. I felt a flare of something sharp move through my chest. Not quite anger, not quite despair, but a mixture of both that made my jaw tighten. Courtney, my doctor gave me a printed list. It's not overblown. It's medical guidance. Brandon set his fork down. I looked at him, felt my heart lift just slightly, the way it always did in those moments when I still believed, stupidly, stubbornly, that my son might step in. Dad, he said, and his voice carried that particular tone of a man who has already decided which direction he's going to fall. Courtney works all day. She comes home and cooks for the whole house. Maybe just eat what's there, and if something bothers your stomach, you can let Dr. Thompson know at your next appointment. The lift in my chest dropped like a stone. All right, I said. I ate 3 bites. The grease hit my stomach like a fist, and by the second bite I could feel the nausea rising in that slow, warning way I'd come to recognize the precursor to a very unpleasant hour. I set my fork down and reached for my water glass, taking slow sips. "Something wrong with it?" Courtney asked, watching me with narrowed eyes. "I'm just pacing myself," I said. Brandon had already turned his attention back to his food. He and Courtney fell into a conversation about someone from her office, and I sat at that table and watched them and felt something settle over me that I can only describe as a kind of terrible clarity. Not sadness exactly. More like the feeling you get when a fog burns off and you can finally see the shape of the terrain you've been walking through. They knew about the dietary list. I'd mentioned it the first week I arrived. I'd left a copy on the refrigerator door held up with a magnet, where any person who cooked in that kitchen would see it every single time they opened the fridge. The food on my plate wasn't carelessness. I excused myself before dessert said my stomach was bothering me, which was completely true, and went back to my room. I sat on the edge of the folding bed and breathed slowly until the nausea ebbed. Then I reached into the nightstand drawer behind the notebook and found the sleeve of plain crackers I'd bought at the CVS 2 weeks back and kept hidden there for exactly this kind of evening. I ate 4 crackers. I drank the rest of my water. I looked at Eleanor's photo on the shelf. "How did they left the list on the fridge?" I told her. "Right there on the fridge, L, under the little magnet shaped like a lighthouse. The one we bought in Maine, remember Brandon's still got it." My voice cracked on the last word. Just slightly. Just enough that I had to press my lips together and wait a moment before I could go on. "I keep telling myself it's thoughtlessness," I said. "I keep telling myself they're just busy, just distracted, just not thinking. But a person who isn't thinking still sees a piece of paper on the refrigerator every morning." Outside my door, I heard the television come on the bright, cheerful noise of some game show filling the living room. I heard Courtney laugh at something, a real laugh, loose and unguarded, the kind she never directed at me. I opened the notebook. I found the page with my 2 entries. I wrote a third one, the date, the plate of reheated food, Brandon's response, the dietary sheet still on the fridge. I wrote it all down in my steady, careful handwriting. Then I sat back and thought about the question that had been circling in my mind all evening, like a bird that couldn't find a place to land. What does a person do when they start to suspect that the people they love most have stopped seeing them as family and started seeing them as something else entirely? I didn't have an answer yet. But the next morning, I walked out to the garage to get my car for Thursday's appointment, and the space where my truck had been parked since the day I arrived was empty. I have driven myself to every single appointment since September. Not because I enjoyed it, and not because I had no one to ask. I did it because asking felt like one more way of confirming something I wasn't ready to confirm, that the people in this house had no intention of showing up for me. As long as I drove myself, I could tell myself it was a choice. My choice. An old man's stubbornness, nothing more. That Thursday morning in early November, I got up at 5:30 dressed in the dark, the way I always did to avoid waking anyone, and walked down the hall to the garage door. The air was already cold, that specific Ohio November cold that gets into your joints and reminds you that you're not young anymore. I had my medication folder tucked under one arm and my wallet in my jacket pocket, carefully counted the night before. I pushed open the garage door. The space where my Ford F-150 had been sitting since the day I arrived was empty. Not just empty, clean. Not even an oil spot on the concrete to mark where it had been. I stood in the doorway for a moment with the cold pouring in around my ankles, and the feeling that moved through me was so large and so tangled that I couldn't separate the individual threads of it. Disbelief, a hot spike of anger. And underneath both of those, something that felt humiliatingly close to hurt. I walked back inside and knocked on Brandon's bedroom door. 3 times firm. He opened it after a minute, hair rumpled, squinting at me. "Dad, it's not even 6. "My truck is gone," I said. I have an appointment at 8:30. Brandon rubbed the back of his neck. Oh, yeah, Courtney took it. She had an early thing. An early thing, I repeated. Her car's in the shop. I thought I told you. He said it with the breezy confidence of a man who absolutely had not told me. Brandon. I kept my voice flat and deliberate. I have a chemotherapy appointment this morning. An appointment we scheduled 3 weeks ago. I need my truck. He winced, a small, performative wince, the kind that acknowledges inconvenience without accepting responsibility for it. I know, Dad. I know. But she's already gone. I can't exactly call her back now she's got a client meeting at 7. He paused, then offered the solution with the cheerful helplessness of a man handing someone a Band-Aid for a broken leg. Just call a Lyft. I'll pay you back. My jaw tightened so hard I felt it in my back teeth. That's my truck, Brandon. I own that vehicle. Courtney didn't ask me. You didn't ask me. Dad, come on. His voice shifted into that placating tone I'd come to despise, smooth and patient, the tone you use with someone you've decided is being irrational. It's just for the morning. She'll have it back by noon. You'll be at the appointment by then anyway, right? I looked at my son standing in that doorway in his rumpled t-shirt, and I felt a grief so acute it was almost physical, a tightening across my chest that had nothing to do with the tumor Dr. Thompson was working to shrink. This was a different kind of pain, the kind that comes from recognizing someone you love and not knowing them at all. I'll call a cab, I said. I turned around and walked back to my room. The cab took 25 minutes to arrive. I waited on the front step in the November wind, my jacket collar turned up, my medication folder pressed flat against my chest. My eyes watered from the cold, at least that's what I told myself. The driver was a heavy-set man in his 60s who took one look at me and turned the heat up without being asked, and that small, wordless kindness nearly undid me completely. Cleveland Clinic, he confirmed, pulling out of the driveway. That's right, I said. Thank you. I watched Brandon's house disappear in the rearview mirror and fixed my eyes on the road ahead. Patricia had the heated blanket ready for me when I got there, which she always did, after she noticed around week 3 that my hands stayed cold long after the infusion started. You doing okay today, hon? She asked, adjusting the line. Little tired, I told her. But I'm here. That's all that counts, she said, and she meant it, and I had to look away at the window for a moment, because the simple decency of it was almost more than I could take. I sat in that blue recliner for 6 hours. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about the truck sitting in some salon parking lot while Courtney got her hair done. I thought about the $20,000 I'd handed Brandon at age 28. The overtime shifts I'd pulled to save it, the look on his face when I'd pressed that check into his hands, the way he'd hugged me. Actually hugged me and said, Dad, I don't know how to thank you. The taxi home cost $34. I tipped the driver $8. I got back to the house at 2:15. My truck was in the garage. Courtney's car was in the driveway back from the shop, apparently. And when I walked through the front door, I found her in the kitchen, unloading shopping bags from Nordstrom Rack and a boutique downtown I didn't recognize the name of. Her hair was freshly blown out, curling at the ends. Her nails were a deep burgundy I hadn't seen before. She looked up when I came in and smiled pleasantly. Oh, how'd it go? I looked at her. I looked at the shopping bags. I looked at my truck keys sitting on the kitchen counter next to a receipt. I didn't mean to read, but read anyway. Salon $94 paid at 10:17 a.m., 40 minutes after my appointment had started. Fine, I said. It went fine. I picked up my keys. I went to my room. I sat down on the folding bed and pressed both hands flat on my knees and breathed through my nose until the shaking in my chest settled down to something manageable. Then I picked up my phone and opened the banking app I hadn't checked in almost 2 weeks. I hadn't wanted to. I think some part of me already knew what I was going to find, and had been delaying the moment of knowing for as long as I possibly could. I opened the account. I looked at the balance, and the world went very, very quiet around me. I sat on that folding bed for a long time with my phone in both hands, the screen casting a pale light across my face in the dim storage room, and I read the transaction history of my medical savings account 4 times, because my brain kept refusing to accept what my eyes were telling it. $8,000. That's what I'd set aside transferred from my main savings account the week before I left Cleveland, specifically for treatment costs. Co-pays, prescriptions, cab fares to appointments, anything the insurance didn't cover. I'd been careful about it. I'd told Brandon about it once briefly in the first week when he'd asked about my finances. Just enough to explain that I had things covered and wouldn't be a financial burden. What I had not done, and this failure sat in my stomach like a swallowed stone, was change the PIN on the debit card linked to that account. It was an old card, one Brandon had used years ago to pull cash for me when I'd been in the hospital briefly for my knee surgery. I'd told him the PIN then. 4 digits, never changed it. Because he was my son and it had never crossed my mind that I needed to protect my money from my own son. The balance on the screen read $3,200. 4 withdrawals over the past 3 weeks. 800 here, 1,200 there, one for 1,500, one for 500, all from ATMs within a 2-mile radius of Brandon's warehouse facility. All pulled during business hours Tuesday through Friday when I was either at appointments or in this room. Nearly $5,000. Gone. My hands were trembling, not the chemical tremble from the chemo drugs, but something rawer and deeper, the shake that comes when your body registers a shock that your mind hasn't finished processing yet. I pressed the phone face down against my knee and sat in the dark and breathed. I thought about calling the bank right then, reporting unauthorized transactions. In Ohio, that would trigger a fraud investigation. The bank would freeze the account, file a report, and depending on what the investigation found, it could lead to criminal charges. Theft by deception. Misuse of financial account access. Brandon could face serious legal consequences. My son. My only child. I put the phone in my nightstand drawer. I turned off the light. I lay down on that folding bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt the kind of pain that doesn't have a clean name. Not anger alone, not grief alone, but the specific agony of a man who built his entire life around one person and is only now understanding what that person actually is. I did not sleep. At 6 the next morning, I heard Brandon's alarm go off down the hall. I heard him moving around the bathroom, the coffee maker. I lay still and waited until the house sounds settled into their morning rhythm. Then I got up, dressed, walked to his bedroom door and knocked. "Yeah." His voice was alert. He was already dressed for work, sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling his phone. "I need 5 minutes," I said. He looked at me, read something in my face, and set the phone down. "Sure, Dad. What's up?" I walked to his desk chair, sat down, and placed my phone on the desk between us. Screen up, the banking app open to the transaction history. I didn't say a word. I just turned the screen so he could see it clearly. Brandon looked at the screen. A muscle in his jaw flickered. His eyes moved down the list of transactions, the dates, the amounts, the ATM locations, and I watched something happen behind his face, a rapid internal calculation, the look of a man deciding very quickly which version of the truth was going to cost him the least. "Dad," he started. "How much of it is left?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt, and I was grateful for that. He exhaled hard through his nose, rubbed the back of his hand across his mouth. Look, I was going to tell you. I've just been dealing with some debt, okay? It got out of hand faster than I expected, and I needed to cover a payment before it went to collections. Brandon. I cut him off quietly, but absolutely. How much of it is left? He looked at the floor. I've got about 2,000 I can put back. Maybe by the end of the month. That money, I said, leaning forward just slightly, is for my cancer treatment. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Not a vacation fund. Not an emergency buffer. That money exists so that I can continue receiving chemotherapy. Without it, I start missing copays. I start skipping prescriptions. And when a man in the middle of stage 2 cancer treatment starts skipping prescriptions, my voice cracked on the last word just barely, and I pressed through it. You know what happens, Brandon? His face had gone a color I'd never seen on him before. Not quite pale, not quite red, somewhere in between. I know, he said, and his voice was low and rough. I know, okay. I wasn't thinking straight. I needed it, and I thought you had your savings as backup. I'm 68 years old, and I have cancer, I said. That is my backup. He said, and then caught himself because he'd slipped into something that wasn't English for just a second, and it rattled him. He corrected course immediately. I mean, I'll pay it back. Every cent. I picked up my phone. I stood up. You have until the end of the week, I said. Every dollar. Back in that account. And Brandon, I paused at the door, turned back to look at my son, this 40-year-old man who couldn't hold my gaze, who was staring at the floor like a child waiting for a punishment he knew he deserved. I need you to understand something. I gave you everything I had. Every overtime shift. Every dollar I didn't spend on myself. I gave it freely because you were my son, and I loved you. But what you took from that account that wasn't giving, that was taking. And there is a difference. A very serious difference. He nodded, jaw tight, eyes down. I walked out of the room and pulled the door shut behind me. In the hallway, I pressed my back against the wall and closed my eyes and let myself feel the full weight of it for exactly 10 seconds. The betrayal, the grief, the terrible, hollowing realization that the man in that room was not the boy I'd packed lunches for, not the kid I'd stayed up with when he had nightmares, not the young man who'd hugged me when I handed him that check. 10 seconds. Then I opened my eyes, straightened up, and walked to the kitchen to make my coffee. I had a chemo appointment on Thursday. I had entries to add to my notebook. And I had started to understand with a cold and absolute clarity that the notebook was going to matter a great deal more than I'd originally thought. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a "still here" in the comments right now. Because what's coming is the kind of thing most people never see until it's too late. And I don't want you to miss a single word of it. Quick note before we continue, parts of this story contain fictionalized details built around a real emotional truth. If that's not something you want to hear, this is your moment to step away. No judgment. But if you're staying, hold on tight. Something was wrong with Courtney on Saturday morning, and it took me until noon to figure out what it was. She was pleasant. Not the brittle, calculated pleasantness she deployed when she wanted something. This was different. Warmer. She smiled at me when I came into the kitchen. Actually smiled the kind that reached the outer corners of her eyes. She asked if I'd slept well. She poured me a cup of coffee without being asked and set it on the counter beside me. And when I thanked her, she waved a hand and said, "Of course, Walter, don't even mention it." I stood there with that coffee cup and felt the hair on the back of my neck rise slowly. In 2 months of living under this roof, Courtney Hayes had never once poured me a cup of coffee unprompted. She had never once asked how I'd slept. The change was so complete, so sudden, that my first thought, shameful as it is to admit, was that I'd misread her all along. That maybe I'd been too harsh. That maybe she'd simply needed time to adjust to having me here. Then Brandon came downstairs and said, "Dave and Carol are driving up from Cincinnati this afternoon." And everything clicked into place. Dave Hayes was Brandon's first cousin, a broad, loud man in his mid-50s who sold agricultural equipment and had strong opinions about football and very little else. His wife Carol was quieter, a retired school teacher with kind eyes and a habit of patting your hand when she talked to you. I'd known them both since Brandon was a child. Good people, genuinely good. Which made what happened that afternoon considerably worse. They arrived at 2 o'clock with a bottle of Merlot and a pie from a bakery in Cincinnati, and the house immediately filled with the kind of noise and warmth that had been entirely absent since September. Dave shook my hand with both of his and said, "Walter, God, it's good to see you. How are you holding up?" And his concern was so unambiguously real that my throat tightened. "I'm managing," I told him. "Day by day." "Ma, that's all you can do," Carol said warmly, squeezing my forearm. "You've got good people around you, that's what matters." And right on cue, Courtney materialized at my elbow with a fresh cup of tea she hadn't made for me in 8 weeks, and she said, "We do everything we can. Walter's comfort is the priority. Isn't that right, babe?" She looked at Brandon with a smile so warm it could have melted ice off a January windshield. Brandon nodded. "Absolutely," he said. "Whatever Dad needs." I wrapped both hands around the teacup so they wouldn't see my knuckles tighten. Over the next 2 hours, I watched Courtney give the performance of her life. She told Dave and Carol about how she adjusted her work schedule to be home when I came back from treatments. She described the special meals she prepared to support my recovery, and I thought of the reheated pork with the grease pooling around the edges, the dietary sheet still pinned under the lighthouse magnet on the refrigerator, and I kept my face perfectly neutral. She mentioned with a sigh of gentle exhaustion how challenging it was to balance everything, but how family always comes first. "You are so lucky," Carol said to me, reaching over to pat my hand, "to have a daughter-in-law who takes care of you like this." I looked at Courtney. She was looking back at me with that warm, open expression, her head tilted just slightly, like a woman waiting to receive a compliment she already knew was coming. "I'm very grateful," I said. My voice didn't crack. I was proud of that. Dave refilled his wine glass and leaned back in his chair. "You know, Walter, it says a lot about Brandon that he stepped up like this. I know a lot of guys our age whose kids are nowhere to be found when things get hard. Brandon accepted this with a modest shrug and the expression of a man being accurately praised. The back of my throat burned. It does say something, I agreed, and I meant it, just not what any of them thought I meant. After dinner, after Dave and Carol had hugged everyone and driven back toward the highway with their empty pie dish, the house went quiet in the particular way it always did when the performance was over. Courtney pulled off her cardigan and dropped it over the back of the sofa. Brandon loosened his collar. Both of them relaxed back into their natural shapes, the shapes I actually lived with. "Good visit," Brandon said, stretching his arms over his head. "Dave's exhausting," Courtney said, "but it was fine." Then she looked at me with an expression that was almost amused. "You were very quiet, Walter." "I'm always quiet," I said. She accepted that and disappeared into the kitchen. Brandon looked at me for a moment, and I saw something move across his face, a flicker of something I couldn't quite read. Then he cleared his throat. "Hey, Dad," he said. "I want you to know Courtney really does care about you. She just doesn't always show it the way you might expect. But she was genuinely glad Dave and Carol got to see that you're okay." I looked at my son. I thought about the $94 salon receipt on the kitchen counter the day he'd told me to call a cab. I thought about the crackers in my nightstand drawer. I thought about the $5,000. "I know she does," I said. I went to bed early that night, but I lay awake a long time staring at the ceiling, turning one thought over and over in my mind. The most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in enough truth that good people can't tell the difference. Dave and Carol were good people. They had absolutely no idea what they'd just witnessed. And neither I was beginning to fear did Brandon. Eleanor made the same turkey recipe every year for 31 years. Dry brine overnight. Butter under the skin. Roasted at 325 for the first hour and then cranked up to 400 for the last 40 minutes to get the skin crisp. She served it with sweet potato casserole, green beans, with almonds, cranberry sauce from scratch, and a cornbread stuffing that she'd adapted from her grandmother's recipe and never written down because she said she didn't need to, it was in her hands. I could smell turkey roasting when I woke up on Thanksgiving morning, and for exactly 4 seconds I forgot where I was. Then I opened my eyes and saw the water-stained ceiling of the storage room, and the stack of Brandon's old cardboard boxes and the single bulb overhead, and the 4 seconds were over. I dressed slowly, the way I always did. Now joints stiff from the cold that seeped through the exterior wall, fingers fumbling with buttons because the neuropathy from the chemo had settled in my hands like a permanent guest. I could hear voices downstairs, already movement in the kitchen, the particular busy energy of a house preparing for company. I combed my hair. I put on the good flannel shirt, the dark green one Eleanor had given me 2 Christmases before she passed. Then I walked downstairs. The kitchen was transformed. Courtney had been up since early morning. Clearly there were multiple dishes in various stages. The counter covered in cutting boards and mixing bowls. The oven already radiating heat. She moved through the space with brisk efficiency, her hair pinned up an apron tied over her clothes. Brandon was at the kitchen table with his laptop half working, glancing up occasionally to answer a question. "Morning," I said from the doorway. "Morning, Walter," Courtney said, without looking up from the pot she was stirring. Her voice was not unkind, but it was not warm either. It was the voice of a woman with 14 things to do who was acknowledging your existence as item 15. "Can I help with anything?" I asked. She considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "We've got it covered. Why don't you just relax? You've got your treatment Tuesday, you should rest up." It was a reasonable thing to say. It even sounded caring. I nodded and poured myself a coffee and sat at the far end of the kitchen table out of the way and watched the preparations happen around me the way you watch something through glass. Guests began arriving at 2. I heard the doorbell, heard Brandon's voice go bright and loud in the way it did when he was performing hospitality. Heard laughter and the sounds of coats being handed off and wine bottles being opened. More voices than I expected, colleagues of Courtney's I gathered, and a couple from their neighborhood who I'd never met. I stayed at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee and waited for someone to come find me. At 2:15, Courtney appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at me with an expression that managed to be both apologetic and final at the same time. "Walter," she said, "you know what? There's a lot of people out there and it gets loud, and with your treatment coming up Tuesday." She tilted her head. "Why don't you take it easy in your room? I'll bring you a plate later. It'll be quieter for you." My chest cracked. Not broke cracked. The way old wood cracks under pressure, a sound more than a fracture, a warning. "I'd like to be with the family today," I said carefully. Courtney's expression didn't change. "I know, and you will be. I just think rest is more important right now. You've been pushing yourself." She said it with the gentle authority of someone who has already made a decision and is simply announcing it in the kindest available packaging. I went to my room. I sat on the folding bed and listened. Through the door and down the hall, I could hear everything: laughter rising and falling in waves, the clink of glasses, someone telling a story that made the whole room erupt. Brandon's voice carrying above the rest, easy and warm and generous in a way I hadn't heard it directed at me in months. The smell of Eleanor's turkey reached me through the gap under the door. I picked up her photograph from the shelf. The one from the Smoky Mountains, the one where she's laughing and the light is in her hair. "It's Thanksgiving, Elle," I said softly. My voice came out rough at the edges, worn down in a way I hadn't let it be in front of anyone. "They've got the whole house full of people out there." I pressed my thumb gently against the glass over her face. I just wanted to sit at a table. That's all I wanted. My eyes burned. I pressed the back of my wrist against them hard, because I was not going to cry in this storage room on Thanksgiving. I was not going to do that to myself. At 6 o'clock, the voices got louder briefly, then began to thin. Goodbye's coats being retrieved, the front door opening and closing in cycles. By 7, the house was quiet again. I opened my door and walked down the hall. The dining table looked like the aftermath of a feast, empty wine bottles, plates, with the pleasant wreckage of a real meal, candles burned low. The turkey carcass sat in the roasting pan. Dishes of sides, most of them nearly empty, were scattered across the counter. No one had brought me a plate. I found a dinner roll in the bread basket, 2 slices of turkey on a serving platter, and a spoonful of sweet potato casserole left in the dish. I put them on a plate by myself, poured a glass of water, and carried it back to my room. Brandon was on the couch watching football. He glanced up as I passed. "Oh, hey, Dad. You doing okay?" "Fine," I said. "Good game." "Cowboys are losing," he said, and turned back to the screen. I ate alone in my room. The turkey was good. I thought about Eleanor's recipe about butter under the skin and cranking up the heat at the end. I ate every bite because I needed the protein and because wasting food felt like one indignity too many. Then I opened the nightstand drawer. I took out the notebook. I had been building something in those pages, entry by entry, and tonight I added one more. The date, the word Thanksgiving, and 3 sentences about what it felt like to eat a dinner roll alone in a storage room while my son watched football 15 feet away. Then I lay back and stared at the ceiling, and a thought settled over me with the quiet weight of absolute certainty. I had not been brought into this house to be cared for. I had been brought here to be managed, and whoever was managing the situation had not yet played their final card. But I was beginning to understand, with every entry in that notebook, with every night in this room, that when they did, I was going to be ready. After Thanksgiving, I started paying attention differently. Not with suspicion, I'd had plenty of that already. This was something more deliberate, more patient. 42 years working on ship engines taught me that the most important information is almost never in the obvious place. It's in the small sounds. The vibration that doesn't match the others. The gauge that reads normal until the second it doesn't. You learn to listen for the thing that's almost right, but not quite. I started listening to this house the way I used to listen to engines. The storage room was at the end of the hallway, close enough to the living room that voices carried through the wall when people forgot to modulate. I'd noticed this in the early weeks and filed it away. Most of what I overheard was unremarkable: Brandon talking about work, Courtney on the phone with her colleagues, the television running at volume. Nothing I needed to hear, nothing I wanted to. Then came the Thursday afternoon in early December, when I woke from a post-treatment nap and lay still in the gray light, letting my body remember where it was and heard Courtney's voice coming through the wall with an unusual clarity. She wasn't shouting. She was speaking in that focused, rapid way people do when they believe they're alone, the way you talk, when you're not performing for anyone, when the audience has left, and you're just saying the thing you actually mean. I didn't move. I barely breathed. "No, listen to me." She was saying, her voice low and fast, carrying the specific urgency of someone mid-argument. "It doesn't have to be complicated. He's already here. He's already dependent on us for everything. The next step is the house. Once the house sells, we clear the debt, and we're done." A pause. Someone on the other end of the line speaking. I couldn't make out the words. "I know what he said," Courtney continued, and her voice sharpened. "But think about it. He's 68. He has cancer. He's not going to live another 10 years, maybe not another 5. What happens to that house then? It sits there, it goes through probate. We get a fraction of what it's worth after legal fees." Another pause. "Exactly. So why not now? Why not while we can actually benefit from it?" My hand found the wall beside the bed. My palm pressed flat against the cold drywall, and I held there like I was checking for a pulse. "Brandon is working on it," she said. "He just needs to find the right moment. The man trusts him. That's the advantage." She laughed, short, dry, completely without warmth. "We just need him to sign. Once he signs, everything else takes care of itself." I heard her footsteps shift, moving further into the living room, and her voice dropped too low to follow. I lay still for another full minute, my hand against the wall, my heart doing something loud and complicated in my chest. Then I sat up slowly, swung my legs over the side of the folding bed, set both feet flat on the floor, and pressed my hands on my knees. The pieces had been there for weeks. The quick agreement on the phone in September. The questions about my property deed asked casually over dinner in October under the guise of insurance paperwork. The way Courtney had asked twice whether I had a will and whether Brandon was named in it. Small questions spread out easy to dismiss individually, but standing together, they formed a shape I recognized now with terrible clarity. I'd been brought here not because Brandon was worried about me. I'd been brought here because they had debt, real debt, the grinding kind that doesn't go away on a warehouse manager's salary, and the equity in my paid-off house on Maple Ridge Drive was the solution they'd landed on. They needed me compliant, grateful, too exhausted, and too sick to look closely at what was happening around me. I walked to the shelf and picked up Eleanor's photograph. The light in the storage room was thin and gray, and her face in the photo looked back at me with that expression she'd had, calm and clear-eyed, the expression of a woman who never wasted time on indignation when she could spend it on solutions. "I see it now, Elle," I said. My voice came out rough and scraped like something that had been sitting unused too long. "I see the whole thing." I set the photograph down gently. Then I opened the nightstand drawer and took out the notebook, the one that had started as a medication schedule and become something else entirely. I found the last entry and read back through all of them. The money, the food, the car, the account, the Thanksgiving dinner I'd eaten alone from a plate I'd assembled myself from other people's leftovers. I picked up the pen, but this time I didn't write an entry. I turned to a fresh page and I began to write something different. Not a record of what had been done to me. A list of what I was going to do about it. I wrote for a long time. When I set the pen down, my hand was aching and my chest felt lighter than it had in months, not healed, not whole, but unclenched. Like a fist that had finally opened. I looked at what I'd written. Then I looked at Eleanor's photograph. "I'm not signing anything," I told her. "Not a single thing." Monday morning, I made 2 phone calls before anyone else in the house was awake. The first was to my bank. I asked to speak with someone in the fraud department, a phrase that felt strange in my mouth when it concerned my own son, but I said it anyway because it was accurate. I explained the situation. An authorized user from years ago had retained access to an account they had no current authorization to use, and several large withdrawals had been made without my knowledge or consent. The woman I spoke to, professional, unhurried, the kind of voice that suggests she'd heard considerably worse, walked me through the process. Freeze the account. Dispute the transactions formally. File a report that would go on record. She confirmed that under Ohio law, what I was describing met the threshold for financial elder abuse, and that the bank's fraud team would open an investigation. The second call took longer to make. Not because I didn't know the number. I'd looked it up 2 weeks ago and written it in the inside cover of the notebook, but because dialing it meant accepting fully and without reservation that the situation had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Martin Kowalski was an elder law attorney in Columbus, recommended by a former dockyard colleague whose father had gone through something similar 6 years back. He answered on the third ring, and when I explained why I was calling, he didn't express shock or offer sympathy in the hollow way people do when they're filling time. He asked questions, specific ones, dates, amounts, documented interactions. He asked whether I had any written records. I have a notebook, I told him. 63 entries over 2.5 months. A brief pause. That's good, Walter, he said. That's very good. Can you photograph each page and email them to me today? I can, I said. Then let's get started. I spent the rest of the morning in my room with the door locked. I'd bought a simple sliding bolt at the hardware store on Friday. Told Brandon it was because I sometimes woke disoriented from the chemo medication and wanted to feel secure, which was true enough. Photographing every page of the notebook on my phone and forwarding them to Martin's office email. I also sent him the bank's fraud report confirmation screenshots of the transaction history and a photograph of the dietary guidelines sheet still pinned to the refrigerator under the lighthouse magnet. Small things individually. Together, Martin had told me they built a picture. After I sent the last file, I sat at the edge of the bed and felt something settle through me. Not quite, but the particular steadiness of a man who has stopped waiting for something to happen and started making something happen instead. I put the notebook in the locked nightstand drawer. I put the key in my jacket pocket. Then I went downstairs and made myself lunch. It was a small thing, but every day prior I had moved through this house like a man trying to take up less space than he occupied, speaking quietly, eating quickly, retreating to my room at the first available opportunity. I had been apologizing constantly for existing, not in words, but in every diminished posture, every hastily cleared dish, every time I said, "I'm sorry to bother you," before asking for a glass of water. I didn't do that anymore. I made a sandwich turkey, the good mustard, 2 slices of the sourdough bread that Courtney bought for herself, and I sat at the kitchen table in the good chair by the window and ate it slowly. I didn't rush. I didn't check to see if anyone was watching. I ate my sandwich and looked out at the backyard where the December sky was doing something beautiful with the low winter light. Brandon came through the kitchen mid-afternoon, stopped when he saw me sitting there, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger. Something more uncertain than anger. "Hey, Dad," he said carefully. "You good?" I looked up at him. I met his eyes directly and held them, not aggressively, not with the heat of accusation, but with the steady level gaze of a man who has decided he will no longer look away first. "I'm better than I've been in a while," I said. "Thank you for asking." Brandon's brow creased. He opened the refrigerator, closed it without taking anything out, and stood there for a moment with his back to me. "You seem different," he said. You doing okay with the treatments? Patricia say anything about your numbers? Numbers are stable, I said. Dr. Thompson is pleased with where things are. Good. He nodded, still not turning around. That's good, Brandon. My voice was quiet, but it carried the way a bell carries, clear and without effort. He turned. I want you to know that I love you. I have always loved you. Whatever happens next, that part doesn't change. He stared at me. His jaw worked once like he was going to say something, then thought better of it. His eyes did something complicated, something that might have been guilt, or might have been fear, or might have been both tangled up together in a way he couldn't sort out quickly enough. I love you too, Dad, he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. I know, I said, and I turned back to the window. I heard him leave the kitchen. I heard his footsteps stop briefly in the hallway, then continue towards the living room. I heard him pick up his phone, and I heard in the low, urgent register of a man trying not to be overheard him begin to dial. I didn't need to hear the conversation. I already knew what he was going to say, that something had changed, that his father wasn't acting the way he was supposed to act, that the plan they'd been running on since September had hit a variable they hadn't accounted for. I finished my sandwich. I rinsed my plate. I walked back upstairs, unlocked my door, and sat down at the edge of the bed. There was one thing I still needed. One piece of evidence Martin had mentioned that would make everything else significantly stronger. I hadn't been able to get it yet, but I was beginning to understand that I wouldn't need to go looking for it. Given enough time, the people who underestimate you always hand it to you themselves. Courtney left for her sales team meeting at 6:15 on Wednesday evening, and the sound of the front door clicking shut behind her was in that moment the most welcome sound I'd heard in weeks. Not because I disliked her presence well, not only because of that, but because for the first time since I'd arrived in this house 3 months ago, the living room contained only 2 people, me and my son. No performance to maintain, no audience to play to. Just a father and the boy he'd raised sitting 10 feet apart in the quiet of a December evening with the television off and the only light coming from the lamp in the corner. I'd been waiting for this. I came out of my room around 7, poured myself a glass of water in the kitchen, and walked into the living room where Brandon was stretched out on the sofa with his phone. He looked up when I came in, and something in his expression shifted, a flicker of awareness, like a man who senses the weather changing before he can see the clouds. Mind if I sit? I asked. Course not, he said, swinging his feet off the cushions to make room. I settled into the armchair across from him. The good one, the one I'd quietly claimed as mine in the last 2 weeks, without asking permission, and I looked at my son for a moment before I spoke. 40 years old. The same jaw, the same hands, the same way of holding his shoulders that he'd had since he was 16. I had built that boy, brick by brick, year by year, shift by shift. And I was looking at him now like a man trying to find something he'd misplaced and couldn't quite locate. I want to talk to you, I said. Just the 2 of us, the way we used to. Brandon set his phone face down on the cushion beside him. Sure, Dad. What's on your mind? I've been thinking about the year you were 12, I said. You remember that winter your mother had just had her first heart scare, and the doctors put her on restricted activity for 3 months. She couldn't work. I was pulling doubles at the dockyard sometimes 6 days a week, and you never complained once. Not about the frozen dinners, not about me being gone. You just handled it. I paused. I was proud of you for that. I don't think I ever told you that directly. Brandon's expression softened. Something genuine moved through it, not guilt, not calculation, just the unguarded warmth of a man being reminded of something that actually meant something to him. "I remember that winter," he said quietly. "I remember you coming home with your hands so raw from the cold, you could barely hold a fork." "Raw and worth it," I said, "because you were fed and warm and your mother had her medication. That's the only math I ever did." I leaned forward slightly, elbows on my knees, looking straight at him. "And when you got into Ohio State, do you remember what I did?" "You cried," Brandon said, and the corner of his mouth pulled up. "First time I ever saw you cry. Happy tears," I said, because I'd been working toward that moment for 18 years. Every overtime shift, every vacation I didn't take, everything I didn't buy for myself, it all went toward making sure you had options I never had. My voice was steady, but my chest ached with the weight of what I was carrying toward the next part of this conversation. "And when you and Courtney found that house on Pinehurst Drive, the one she loved because of the kitchen, you came to me short on the down payment. Do you remember what I told you?" Brandon's expression grew careful, watchful. "You said you'd cover it. I said I'd cover it because you're my son, and that's what fathers do. I worked 6 months of overnight shifts to put together that $20,000. I was 58 years old, and my back was already giving me trouble, and I did it without a single complaint. Because seeing you get something you wanted, something real, something lasting, that was enough for me." I set my water glass down on the side table. "I gave you that money freely, Brandon. No strings, no expectation of repayment. Because I wanted to." Brandon's jaw tightened. He knew where this was going. He'd known since I came into the room. "Dad, let me finish." My voice was quiet, but it did not waver. 3 weeks ago, I opened my banking app and found nearly $5,000 missing from the account I set aside specifically for my cancer treatment. ATM withdrawals, Brandon, near your office during your work hours. I watched his face, the color draining from it, the way his hands gripped the edge of the sofa cushion. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what happened. And I'm not asking you to pretend either." Brandon exhaled hard through his nose. His knee bounced once, twice. When he finally spoke, his voice had the rough, pressured quality of a man pushing words out through resistance. "I was going to tell you," he said. I've been in a bad spot financially. Courtney and I have debt that's been building for 2 years, and I panicked. I knew you had your savings as backup, and I thought I'd just cover it before you noticed, and you'd never have to know." "But I noticed," I said. "Yeah." He rubbed the back of his hand across his mouth. "Yeah, you noticed." "Brandon." I leaned forward a little more. "I need you to hear me say something. What I gave you over the years, the tuition, the down payment, everything, I gave it because I love you. Because that is what a father does when he has something to give, and his child needs it. But what you took from that account—" My voice cracked just slightly on the edge of the next word, and I pressed through it. "That is not the same thing. Giving and taking are not the same thing. The difference between them is the difference between love and theft." Brandon's eyes went red at the rims. His throat worked. "You raised me." He started, then caught himself the way he sometimes did when emotion pushed him back toward something older than English. He reset. "You raised me," he said. "You gave me everything. How is it wrong for me to need help now?" "It isn't wrong to need help," I said. "It is wrong to take it without asking. It is wrong to take it from a man's medical fund. It is wrong to take it and say nothing and hope the man is too sick to notice." Each sentence landed separately, clearly, without heat, not an accusation, but a reckoning. "I would have given it to you, Brandon. If you'd come to me and said, "Son, I'm drowning, I'm scared, I need help," I would have given it to you. That's who I am. That has always been who I am. Brandon pressed the back of his wrist against his eyes. His shoulders were shaking slightly, a barely contained tremor, the involuntary kind. "So what now?" he asked, and his voice came out raw and young, the voice of the 12-year-old boy who'd handled a hard winter without complaining. "Well, now, I said, you think very carefully about what kind of man you want to be. Not the kind Courtney needs you to be. Not the kind that's convenient. The kind you actually want to look back and say you were." I stood up slowly, my knees protesting the cold the way they always did now. "I love you. That part never changes. But love doesn't mean I'll let you do this to me." I picked up my water glass and walked back down the hall. Behind me, I heard Brandon pull in a long, unsteady breath. And then after a few seconds, I heard him pick up his phone and dial. I didn't stop walking. I already knew who he was calling, and that was perfectly fine. Because Martin Kowalski had told me last week that the one piece of evidence that would make everything else significantly stronger was Brandon acknowledging the situation directly. I went back to my room and added a new entry to the notebook. Date time every word Brandon had said. Then I sat back and thought about how people who underestimate you tend to do exactly what you need them to do. Saturday mornings used to be my favorite part of the week. Back on Maple Ridge Drive, Eleanor and I had a ritual coffee first, always before anything else. She'd take hers with 2 sugars and a splash of cream, and I'd take mine black, and we'd sit at the kitchen table for 40 minutes before the day started and just talk. About nothing important. About the neighbors, about what needed fixing in the yard, about whatever she'd been reading. Those 40 minutes were worth more to me than anything else the week had to offer. I thought about that on Saturday morning, as I reached into the space in the storage room, where I kept my clothes, looking for the red flannel shirt. It wasn't there. I checked twice, moving the hangers, slowly checking behind the heavier jacket I'd hung in front. Then I checked the shelf above in case I'd folded it instead of hanging it. Then I checked the floor behind the boxes. Nothing. I stood in the middle of that storage room, with my hand pressed against the side of my neck, a habit I'd developed lately, when my thoughts needed a moment to settle, and I thought through my last memory of the shirt. Tuesday morning. I'd worn it to breakfast and then changed into a warmer sweater before my treatment. I'd hung it back on the hanger. I was certain of it. I walked down the hall to the living room. Courtney was standing near the front window with her phone in one hand and my red flannel shirt draped over her other arm. She was showing it to someone on a video call, holding it up, turning it, saying something I caught only the end of. "It's got that whole vintage mountain man thing, right? I think it actually works." I stopped in the doorway. She must have heard me because she lowered the phone and looked over. For a fraction of a second, something moved through her expression. Not guilt exactly, more like the momentary recalibration of someone caught doing something they didn't expect to be caught doing. Then it smoothed over. "Oh, Walter," she said breezily. "I was just borrowing this. I wanted to show my friend she's looking for something for her husband for Christmas, and I thought this style was what she meant." My jaw tightened so hard, I felt the pressure in the back of my skull. That shirt was the last Christmas gift Eleanor had ever given me. She'd wrapped it herself, put it under the tree, and laughed when I opened it, and said it was the exact color of a holly berry. I had worn it every December for 7 years. "Give it to me, please," I said. My voice came out quiet, utterly flat. Courtney tilted her head the way she did when she was deciding how much resistance to deploy. "I was just looking at it." "Courtney." I walked into the room, crossed the distance between us, and held out my hand. "That shirt belongs to me. It was a gift from my wife. Please hand it to me right now." She held my gaze for a moment, And I held hers, and I did not look away, and I did not soften, and I did not fill the space with an apology or a qualification. She could see in my face that this was not negotiable, and that I was not going to pretend otherwise. She put the shirt in my hand. "It's just a shirt, Walter," she said, her voice cooling several degrees. "You don't have to make it into a whole thing." "You're right," I said pleasantly. "It's just a shirt. Which is why it should be easy to remember that my things are my things, and you ask before you touch them." Her eyes narrowed. Something shifted behind them, a recalculation, a decision to escalate. "You know," she said, her voice taking on that particular edge that meant she'd decided to drop the pleasantness entirely. "Most people who are staying in someone else's home for free have a little more flexibility about these things." "I'm not staying for free," I said. "I'm your family, and even if I were a stranger paying rent, the answer would be the same, you ask." Courtney opened her mouth, but before she could speak, footsteps came down the stairs, and Brandon appeared in the living room doorway. He took in the scene, Courtney with her jaw tight, and her arms crossed me, standing with the flannel shirt in my hand, and his face went through several expressions in rapid succession. "Everything okay?" he asked. "I found Courtney with my flannel shirt," I said. I turned to face my son directly. "Brandon, I need you to hear something from me, and I need you to actually hear it, not just nod. I am your father. I am 68 years old, and I have cancer, and I am going through chemotherapy, and in spite of all of that, I have worked very hard not to be a burden in this house. But not being a burden doesn't mean I have no rights. It doesn't mean my belongings are available for anyone to pick up and use without asking. It doesn't mean I owe Courtney or anyone else an apology for expecting basic respect." Brandon's throat moved. His hands came up slightly at his sides, an involuntary gesture I recognized from when he was a teenager, getting a talking to the body language of someone absorbing something they know is true. "I'm not your housemate," I continued, my voice steady and unhurried. "I'm not your burden. I'm not your charity case. I am your father. And I expect to be treated like one." Courtney made a sound, a short, sharp exhale of irritation, and turned on her heel toward the kitchen. Her footsteps were deliberate and loud on the hardwood, the footsteps of a woman communicating displeasure through architecture. Brandon stood where he was. His face had gone pale around the edges, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't seen there in months. Not the careful blankness he usually wore. Not the performative neutrality. Something raw. Something that looked at its core like fear. Not of me. I didn't think it was of me. Fear of what was coming. Fear of something he couldn't yet name but could feel the shape of the way you feel a storm before the sky changes. I shook out the flannel shirt, smoothed the collar, and slipped it on over my thermal undershirt. The fabric was soft in the way only well-worn things get broken in over years of use, carrying the weight of 100 Saturday mornings. I buttoned it slowly all the way to the collar. Brandon watched me do it. He hadn't moved from the doorway. "I love you, son," I said, and I walked past him toward the kitchen to put the coffee on. Behind me, I heard him exhale long and slow, the breath of a man who has been holding something in his chest and doesn't yet know how to set it down. I have lived long enough to know that when someone who has never been kind to you suddenly becomes very kind, they want something. Courtney cooked on Sunday evening. Really cooked the kind of meal that requires planning and effort and a trip to the grocery store specifically for it. Baked salmon with lemon and dill. Roasted asparagus. Brown rice. She set the table properly with placemats I hadn't seen since I arrived, and when she brought my plate out, it was exactly what Dr. Thompson's dietary sheet called for. I sat down and looked at the plate, and looked at Courtney, who was smiling at me with the full warmth she usually reserved for audiences. "I looked up some recipes that would be good for you," she said pleasantly, settling into her chair. During treatment, I mean. Wanted to make sure you're eating right. The dietary sheet had been on the refrigerator for 11 weeks. Thank you, Courtney, I said. This looks wonderful, and it did. The salmon was perfectly cooked. The asparagus had the right amount of char. I ate every bite with the calm, focused attention of a man who understands that a good meal might be a transaction, and who has decided that accepting the meal doesn't mean accepting the terms. We talked through dinner about small things. Brandon mentioned a project at the warehouse. Courtney asked about my last treatment, whether my neuropathy had improved. She asked it the way a person asks who knows what neuropathy is, which told me she'd looked it up recently. The performance was polished. I gave it the audience it deserved, polite, warm, entirely non-committal. It was after Brandon cleared the plates that the real conversation began. He sat back down at the table rather than disappearing to the living room the way he usually did, and I noticed Courtney refill her water glass and stay seated too. A coordinated stillness settled over the table, the kind that precedes a prepared statement. Dad, Brandon said, we've been wanting to talk to you about something, about your future, about what makes sense going forward. All right, I said. Courtney leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the table, her voice carrying the measured warmth of a woman who sold insurance for a living and knew how to frame a difficult conversation. We've been thinking about your house in Cleveland, she said. You're here now, you're getting treatment, and the house is just sitting there, empty. Nobody maintaining it and nobody keeping an eye on it through the winter. And with everything you're dealing with health-wise. She paused, tilting her head in that way she had. It just seems like it might make more sense to sell it. Use that equity to cover your medical costs, maybe put some aside for the future. And it would mean you're not carrying the worry of a property you can't look after right now. I looked at her. I looked at Brandon, who was watching me with the careful expression of a man who has rehearsed this and is waiting to see if it lands. I thought about the house on Maple Ridge Drive, the roses Eleanor had planted along the front fence, the kitchen where I'd made 40 years of breakfasts, the bedroom where she'd taken her last breath on a Tuesday morning in October. I thought about what it would mean to sign that house away, not just financially, but in every other sense that mattered. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow sip. That's something to think about, I said. Brandon straightened slightly. The market's actually really strong right now, Dad. Houses in that area are moving fast. If we listed it in January, let me think about it, I said again in exactly the same tone as before. A beat of silence. Courtney's smile held, but her eyes recalculated. Of course, she said. Take your time. We just want what's best for you. I know you do, I said pleasantly. I stood up, thanked Courtney again for dinner, and walked back down the hall to my room with my back straight and my steps even. Behind me, I heard the low, urgent percussion of two people beginning to debrief. Courtney's voice, dropping to a rapid murmur, Brandon responding in the same register. I heard Courtney say, "Why didn't he say anything? He just..." And Brandon, "I don't know. He just said he'd think about it." I closed my door quietly, sat down on the edge of the folding bed, and felt something happen in my chest that I hadn't felt in months. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter and more durable than either of those. I pressed my hand flat over my sternum and held it there. They were scared. For the first time since September, they were the ones who didn't know what was coming next. And I had learned over 68 years of living that a frightened person who feels cornered will always, always reach for the most extreme option available to them. All I had to do was wait. They didn't wait long. By Monday afternoon, the Wi-Fi password had been changed. I discovered this when I tried to connect my phone to send Martin an update and found myself locked out of the network I'd been using since September. I walked to the kitchen where Courtney was working at the counter and asked as neutrally as I could manage whether there was a new password. She turned halfway toward me, not enough to fully face me. "Oh, the router was acting up, so Brandon reset everything. I'll get you the new one later." Later did not come Monday. It did not come Tuesday morning either. By Tuesday evening, I was using my phone's cellular data, expensive, slow, and limited, to send emails, and I had made a note in the margin of the notebook: Wi-Fi access removed, no new password provided. Date. Time. The second change happened at dinner Monday night. Courtney set 2 plates on the table. Not 3, too. She and Brandon sat down and began eating, and I stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the counter where my portion should have been. "Courtney," I said. "Did you— Oh." She looked up, her expression arranged into mild surprise that didn't reach her eyes. "I figured you'd want to manage your own diet since you're so particular about it. There's stuff in the fridge." She turned back to her plate. There was stuff in the fridge. 3 eggs, half a block of cheddar cheese, the end of a loaf of bread, and a container of leftover soup I'd made myself 5 days ago. I made a sandwich. I ate it standing at the counter because sitting at the table uninvited felt like one humiliation too many, and I was choosing very carefully now which battles to have and when. The battle I'd been waiting for came Tuesday evening. I was reading in the armchair in the living room, a habit I'd reclaimed in the past 2 weeks, sitting in the chair by the window, because the light was better there, and because it was my right to sit in it. When Courtney came in from the kitchen, looked at me with an expression stripped entirely of its usual performance, and said, "Walter, we should talk about the timeline." Brandon appeared in the doorway behind her. He didn't sit down. He stood with his arms loose at his sides, and the posture of a man who has agreed to be present for something without agreeing to lead it. "What timeline?" I asked. I set my book down on my knee. "For your stay," Courtney said. "You've been here since mid-September. That's almost 4 months. When we agreed to this, it was supposed to be temporary." "I'm still in treatment," I said. "I understand that. But we have a household to run. We have our own lives." Her voice was completely flat now. No warmth, no performance. The sound of a woman who has decided that the careful approach has failed and is moving to something more direct. "This is our home, Walter. We get to decide who lives here and for how long. And honestly," she crossed her arms, "4 months is long enough." I looked at her. Then I looked at Brandon. My son stood in the doorway with his arms at his sides and his jaw tight, and he met my eyes for exactly 2 seconds before his gaze moved to the window behind my left shoulder. But he did not move toward me. He did not open his mouth. He stood next to his wife in the place where the man who was supposed to be my partner in raising him should have stood. That more than anything, Courtney said, was the thing that cracked something open in my chest. Not broke it, not shattered it, but opened it the way cold opens a crack in stone. Slowly, irreversibly. "I see," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I understand." I stood up from the armchair, picked up my book, and walked past both of them toward the hallway. At the entrance to the hall, I stopped. "Brandon," I said without turning around, "I hope you know what you're choosing right now. Not what Courtney is choosing. What you are choosing." I walked to my room. I closed the door. I sat on the folding bed and pressed both palms flat on my knees and breathed through my nose until the cracking feeling in my chest settled into something I could hold. Then I picked up my phone and called Martin Kowalski. He answered on the second ring. "Martin." I said, "I'm ready. Everything's in place." "When do you want to move?" he asked. I looked out the small window of the storage room. The December sky outside was the color of pewter heavy and low, the kind of sky that meant snow before morning. "Thursday," I said. "Before Christmas." "I'll have everything prepared," Martin said. "Walter, you're doing the right thing." I set the phone down on the nightstand beside the locked drawer. I looked at Eleanor's photograph on the shelf. "Almost Elle," I said softly. "Almost. December 24th. I woke at 5 in the morning without an alarm, the way I always did when something important was waiting on the other side of the day. The storage room was dark, except for the thin line of hallway light under the door, and I lay still for a moment, looking up at the water-stained ceiling that had been the last thing I saw every night for 3.5 months. I said goodbye to it without ceremony. Then I sat up, swung my legs over the side of the folding bed, and began to move. I dressed slowly and carefully, the good trousers, the red flannel shirt, a clean undershirt. I combed my hair in the small mirror I'd propped on the shelf beside Eleanor's photograph. Then I lifted the photograph, gently wrapped it in the flannel cloth I'd been using as a dust cover, and placed it in the top of the duffel bag. I packed my clothes in 30 minutes. Everything fit into the same bag I'd arrived with, plus the small canvas tote I'd bought at CVS in October. I set both bags by the door and sat down on the edge of the folding bed one final time. I opened the notebook. I read it from the first entry, October 13th, 100 tal, missing from wallet, all the way through to the last one I'd written 2 nights ago. 67 entries. 3.5 months of dates and amounts and exact words spoken and the names of people who had said them. It was Martin had told me last week, one of the most thorough records of financial elder abuse documentation he had seen in 15 years of practice. I closed the notebook and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket next to my phone. I called Martin at 7:30. He answered immediately. "Everything is filed," he said without preamble. "The fraud report from the bank is attached. The transaction records are certified. If Brandon attempts to dispute anything, the ATM location data and timestamps put him at those machines during his work hours. It's airtight, Walter." "And the conservatorship attempt?" I asked. That was what Courtney's phone call yesterday had been. I'd looked up the terminology after I heard her sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold, while I researched durable power of attorney and guardianship law on my phone. She'd been asking a lawyer how to have me declared legally incapacitated so she could control my assets without my signature. "She can't do it," Martin said, and his voice was absolutely flat, with the confidence of a man stating a geometric proof. "You have full legal capacity. You're cognitively intact, you're managing your own medical decisions, and you have documentation proving it. Any attempt to pursue guardianship against a competent adult is not only doomed to fail, it becomes evidence of intent to defraud. She's handed us exactly what we needed." My chest expanded with something that felt like the first full breath I'd taken since September. "Thank you, Martin." "Call me after you've spoken to them," he said. "I'll be available all day." I called my old friend Pete Garrity, next 64 years old, retired pipefitter, still living 2 streets over from Maple Ridge Drive in Cleveland. We'd known each other for 30 years, the kind of friendship that doesn't require maintenance because it's built on something too solid to need it. In Walter, he said, warm and immediate, "You headed home." "Today," I said. "I'll be there by evening. Is the offer still open?" "The guest room's been made up since you called last week," Pete said. "Carol made the bed herself. You stay as long as you need." The relief that moved through me at those words, simple, uncalculated, freely given, was so acute it made my eyes burn. I pressed the back of my wrist against them hard. "Tell Carol thank you," I managed. "Tell her yourself tonight," Pete said. "Drive safe." I spent the rest of the morning in my room. The house was quiet. Brandon and Courtney slept late on weekends and holidays. Another rhythm I'd mapped over months of early mornings. By 10 o'clock, I could hear them moving around upstairs, the coffee maker running the low sound of a Christmas morning playlist coming from the kitchen speaker. At 2 in the afternoon, I came out and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. I made myself the way I'd been doing for 2 weeks. The kitchen was warm and smelled of cinnamon from something Courtney had baked, and for a moment I let myself just sit inside that warmth and hold it. Even borrowed comfort is still comfort. Brandon came through on his way to the living room. He slowed when he saw me, and I watched something move across his face. The same hesitation I'd seen more and more in the past 2 weeks. The expression of a man standing at a door he knows he should open, but can't make himself reach for the handle. He opened his mouth. His jaw moved once. Then, from the living room, Courtney called, "Brandon, can you come look at this?" And the moment dissolved. He walked away. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and sat with the warmth of it for a long time. 20 minutes later, from down the hall, I heard Courtney's voice. Low, rapid, the focused urgency I recognized from the first conversation I'd overheard 3 weeks ago. I didn't move from the kitchen table. I didn't need to. The house carried sound the way it always had. "So I'm calling on behalf of a family matter," she was saying. "My father-in-law has a serious medical condition, and we're concerned about his capacity to manage his own affairs. I wanted to understand the process for establishing a power of attorney, or potentially a conservatorship in the state of Ohio if the person is unwilling to." I set my coffee mug down on the table. The ceramic made a small firm sound against the wood. Final as a period at the end of a sentence, I sat for a moment, with my hands flat on the table and my eyes straight ahead, and I felt something move through me, not anger, not grief, but the cold, clarifying recognition of a thing confirmed. Martin had predicted this. He'd told me that when the soft approach failed, they would reach for the legal mechanism, and Courtney had reached right on schedule for a door that was locked from the inside, and always had been. I stood up. I walked down the hall. I stopped outside the living room door and knocked twice clearly with my knuckles. "Brandon," I said, my voice carrying easy and calm through the wood. "Courtney, tonight I need to speak with you both. After dinner. It's important." I walked back to my room. I sat down on the edge of the folding bed for the last time, though I didn't say that, and I looked at the empty space on the shelf where Eleanor's photograph had stood. "One more day, Elle," I said quietly. "One more morning and we go home." Christmas morning arrived gray and still, with an inch of new snow on the ground and the particular quiet that settles over a neighborhood when most of its people are inside with their families. I was up at 6. I was dressed by 6:15. My bags were already packed and standing by the door, and I had placed Eleanor's wrapped photograph carefully on top of the duffel where I could reach it easily. I sat on the edge of the folding bed in the storage room that had been my home since mid-September, and I looked at the empty shelf, at the stack of boxes that had witnessed 3.5 months of a man's quiet endurance. And I said what needed to be said to the room and to the woman whose memory had kept me company in it. We're going home today." I walked out at 9 o'clock and found Brandon and Courtney in the living room, coffee cups in hand, the Christmas tree lights blinking in the corner. Courtney was wearing a robe. Brandon had his hands wrapped around his mug, the way he did when he was cold or when he was nervous, and I could see from the set of his jaw that Courtney had been talking to him since early morning, preparing him. "Sit down, please," I said. "Both of you." They sat. I remained standing, and I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and removed the notebook. I set it on the coffee table between us. Then I took out my phone, opened the photos, and laid it face up beside the notebook, the transaction history organized by date, the ATM locations highlighted in the screenshots Martin had helped me annotate. "I want to tell you what I know," I said. "And I'm going to ask you not to interrupt me until I'm finished." "Can you do that?" Brandon's throat moved. Courtney's jaw tightened, but she gave a short, sharp nod. "On October 13th, I began $100 went missing from my wallet. 3 days later, 300 more. I logged both incidents in this notebook." I touched the cover. "On November 4th, I opened my medical savings account and found 4 unauthorized withdrawals totaling $4,800. The transactions originated from ATMs within 2 miles of your warehouse, Brandon, during your business hours." I looked at my son. His face had gone the color of old concrete. "I reported this to the bank on December 2nd. They opened a fraud investigation. Under Ohio law, what occurred meets the statutory definition of financial elder abuse." Courtney's breath came in sharp and fast. "Walter, that is completely—" I asked you not to interrupt," I said. My voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. "Yesterday afternoon I heard you on the phone, Courtney. You were asking an attorney about establishing a conservatorship, about having me declared legally incapacitated so you could manage my assets without my signature." I turned to look at her fully. Her face was white, not pale white, the color of someone who has just understood that the wall they were walking toward is made of glass, and they've already stepped through it. "That call has been added to the record Martin Kowalski is filing on my behalf. Elder financial abuse, attempted fraud, pattern of behavior documented over 14 weeks. Brandon stood up so fast his coffee mug tilted on the cushion beside him. "Dad, sit down, son." My voice cracked on the last word, not from weakness but from the sheer weight of saying it. Son. This man who had taken money from my medical account. This man who had stood next to his wife while she told me my time in their home was up. This man who had walked out of a kitchen rather than say one true thing in my defense. Brandon sat down. "Yeah, I'm not going to court," I said. "That is not what this is. Martin has filed the fraud report. The bank will pursue recovery of the funds. Beyond that." I paused and felt something enormous move through my chest. "I am not interested in destroying you, Brandon. I am interested in telling you the truth." I looked at my son, really looked at him the way I used to look at him, when he was small and something was wrong. And I needed him to understand that whatever it was, he could tell me. "You did not hurt me once," I said. "You didn't make one mistake that I could forgive and move past. You made a choice every single day for 3.5 months to not protect me. Every morning you walked out of a kitchen rather than say one true word. Every dinner you let her feed me food that was making me sicker. Every time she spoke to me like I was something inconvenient, you were standing close enough to hear it, and you chose to look at the wall." My voice was entirely steady. My eyes were burning so badly that the room had gone slightly blurred at the edges, and I did not look away. "That is what I will carry from this house. Not the money, not the food, not the room. The fact that my son was 10 feet away every single day and chose not to see me." Brandon's face crumpled. His shoulders dropped and his chest caved inward, and a sound came out of him, not a word, just a sound raw and broken and young, the sound of a man feeling something he has been refusing to feel for a very long time. "Dad," he said. The word came out wrecked. "Dad, I I said, and I meant it. I believed him in that moment, believed that somewhere under everything that Courtney had built around him and everything he had let be built, there was still the boy who had managed a hard winter without complaining. I believed it, and it broke my heart clean through. Courtney stood up. Her robe pulled tight, her jaw set. "This is ridiculous," she said, and her voice had the bright, sharp edge of a woman performing outrage, because outrage was the only card she had left. "You are a sick old man who has been living in our home for free, and now you're threatening us with—" "Courtney." My voice stopped her the way a hand stops a door. "You called a lawyer yesterday to find out how to take my house while I'm still alive and breathing." I picked up the notebook and the phone from the table. "I think we both know you don't have the standing to call anyone ridiculous." She pressed her lips together so hard they went white. I looked at Brandon one last time. He was staring at the floor, forearms on his knees, and his shoulders were shaking with the slow, suppressed tremor of a man fighting something he is losing. Part of me wanted to cross the room and put my hand on his back the way I used to when he was a child, and the world had been unkind to him. I didn't. Some lessons have to be carried without being softened. "I'm leaving today," I said. "My attorney has everything he needs. The bank will be in contact. Beyond that," I exhaled slowly, "I hope someday you find your way back to being the man I raised. I genuinely do." I walked down the hall to the storage room. I picked up my duffel bag and my canvas tote. I picked up Eleanor's photograph. I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the cold Christmas morning air. The snow on the front walk was undisturbed. My truck was in the driveway, keys in my jacket pocket where they had been since I moved them there 2 weeks ago. I loaded my bags into the bed, started the engine, and let it warm up for a minute while I sat with my hands on the steering wheel and the heater coming to life around me. The drive to Cleveland took 40 minutes on clear roads. I parked on Maple Ridge Drive just before noon and sat in the truck for a moment, looking at the house. The snow had settled on the roof and the fence posts and the bare branches of the maple in the front yard. Eleanor's rose bushes stood along the front fence in their winter dormancy, cut back to the canes wrapped in burlap, the way I'd wrapped them before I left in September. I got out of the truck. I walked up to the front fence and stood in front of those rose bushes, and I pressed my hand gently against the burlap wrapping on the nearest one. "I'm home, Elle," I said. The street was quiet. The snow absorbed the sound. Somewhere down the block, a child was laughing. Christmas morning, laughter, unguarded and bright, the best kind of sound in the world. I reached into my bag and found Eleanor's photograph. I unwrapped it from the flannel cloth and held it up for a moment in the pale December light so she could see the roses. Then I walked up to the front door, put my key in the lock, and went inside. That night, sitting in Eleanor's kitchen on Maple Ridge Drive, I held her photograph for a long time and thought about everything I should have done differently. I should have asked harder questions in September. I should have trusted the knot in my stomach the night Brandon answered too fast. I should have remembered what Eleanor always told me. Walter, love doesn't ask you to disappear. If you're watching this and you have a parent who is aging, who is sick, who is quietly shrinking themselves to take up less space in your life, please see them. Not their assets. Not the house they own. Not the account balance. Them. This is what revenge dad stories are never really about revenge. They're about a person who had to be seen by the people who were supposed to love them most. And family justice, real family justice, doesn't come from a courtroom. It comes from the moment a man stops apologizing for existing and starts living on his own terms again. I don't know if Brandon will find his way back. I pray to God he does. Because the door on Maple Ridge Drive isn't locked. It never will be. That's the difference between a father and what he became. I still choose love even now. My only advice: don't wait until someone hands you a laundry basket after chemotherapy to understand what you're worth. You don't have to earn your place in your own story. Every revenge dad finds that out eventually. I just wish I'd found it sooner. If this story moved something in, you drop a comment below and tell me what you felt. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe in family justice the way I do, subscribe so you never miss another story like this one. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. And one gentle note before you go: some stories on this channel contain fictionalized elements created with the sole purpose of sharing meaningful life lessons. If that's not the content for you, no hard feelings. Choose what serves your heart best. But if you're still here, I'll see you in the next one.